To start proceedings. So over to you, Paul.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much, Paul, for your very kind introduction. It's a pleasure to have you with us again. And it's a pleasure to have so many people from all over the world join us. Thank you so much for all of you who have taken time out to listen to what we have to say and for your interest in the book. It's been amazing, the reception that we've had to our publication of the book so far. Let's say a special thanks to our publisher, Amy Thornton, who's with us today. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for believing in the idea of this book as well. Thank you to all of Sage, to the publication team, to the typesetters, the proofreaders, you name it, the cover designer. I think you'll agree that the cover is pretty amazing as well. Thank you to everybody. Really, really grateful for the ways that you've interacted with us and the way that you've allowed us to do this book in such a good way. So thank you. So yes, as Paul described, we're going to be talking through what is in the book, and later on you will have your opportunity to ask us some questions if you wish. If you want to do that, please put them into the chat, and Paul is going to try to group them together and ask us at the end. There may be lots of questions about different things, questions about exams more broadly. We, of course, want to talk about the book. So if you think we're going to answer questions about what we here at Cambridge do in exams, you're in the wrong place. We're not going to start discussing what happened with exams last year, for example. That's not what we're here for today. It's about the book, and above all, to try to support you as teachers, educators, whoever you might be, to try to understand more about the very important topic of assessment. Those of you who live in the UK will know I'm our Chief Medical Officer, Chris Whitty, and I'm going to be using his catchphrase. Next slide, please, Simon. Thank you. So why this book? Why did we decide to write this book? Well, first of all, a slight personal story here. I taught in schools in the UK and in universities in France for quite a number of years before I disappeared behind the scenes, initially to work for the International Baccalaureate Organisation and more recently for Cambridge Assessment International Education. And I must admit, when I was a teacher, I didn't know that much about assessment. I did my PGCE, my postgraduate certificate in education, shockingly here at Cambridge University, and back in the day they didn't tell us that much about assessment, how it works, what it's about. I didn't know much about the terminology. So when I came here back to Cambridge 10-11 years ago, I thought, well, I ought to know a lot more. I work for an assessment organisation now. I need to become conversant with the terms. And it opened up my eyes and ears to a whole world, really, which I wish I'd known a lot about before. And I've discovered, as I've been researching the book and talking to colleagues and people around the world over the last several years, how many people share the same experience as me. And there's two examples here on the screen in front of you of recent publications which have very much reflected that. On the left-hand side, there's a recent publication actually also by Sage, which is called the Early Career Framework Handbook, published by the Chartered College of Teaching and the Department for Education in the United Kingdom, which is really reflecting the fact that teachers, when they're starting out, they need to know certain things. They need confidence in certain areas, amongst which assessment. On the right-hand side, you'll see the second of two reports, or a snapshot from it, from the Centre for Education and Youth, with whom we partner here fairly often at Cambridge Assessment. Their second publication was called Making Waves. Hopefully you can make out on the screen there some of the words that are described there. And it's really quite stark what they're saying there. Only 1/3 of classroom teachers, so 1 in 3, feel very confident conducting assessment as part of their day-to-day teaching. And if you consider just how important assessment has become as part of gauging how well teachers or schools are doing, or simply, not even simply, it's very importantly, helping students get to the next level, that's something which we need to address. So there's a need for training, as it says there. 1 in 5 classroom teachers don't know where to go to look for information. So 20%, 1 in 5 teachers don't know where to go. Well, hopefully a book such as this one is going to help people immediately have something behind them, on a shelf beside them, wherever it might be, that they can refer to if they want to know about terminology or have some ideas about how to progress in the future. And also, under half of teachers have received any training on assessment, and that's an important thing which we've been looking at here as an organisation, but also it's very important from the inspiration for the book as well. How can we help teachers through various forms of PD, including their own self-study, their own reading, understand more about this topic? So again, next slide, please, Simon. So here again is further inspiration. These are some of the courses that we offer at Cambridge University Press and Assessment, as we're now called. And you'll notice there, top left-hand side, Understanding Assessment, a Practical Course for Teachers. Simon and I actually wrote this book during the pandemic. So we wrote it from, I don't know, about August last year till February this year, Simon, I think, roughly speaking. And very soon after that, he and I got together again and said, let's now write a course for teachers, together with some colleagues who are here on the call with us today as well. And that course is very much designed to try to help teachers to get some of the fundamentals. This book is a great accompaniment to that course, and indeed to the other 3 courses and more that you can see on the screen there. For example, the Postgraduate Advanced Certificate in Educational Studies in Educational Assessment, offered again at Cambridge University, and the online either self-study or tutor-led courses, A101, A102 featured. And last but not least, if you look in the middle at the bottom there, I think you're going to struggle to see that because I can't see it much on my screen, but that's an octagon which explains what we call the teacher standards. We've worked very hard at this as an organisation, but also it's useful for teachers all over the world to consider it. And the 5th one of those talks about the need to, let me get this right, to implement effective planning, teaching, learning, and assessment practice. So it's incumbent on us as teachers to understand a lot more about assessment. Next slide, please, Simon. And last from me for now, here's a couple of other little bits, quotes from the book directly. In our introduction, you'll see there about how we express very much that assessment is something which is all around us. You'll see if you read the book and you read some of the little anecdotes and stories in other ways that we've put at the beginning of some of the chapters, that we all get assessed at various points. So Simon, for example, mentions about his driving test and his brother and competing with him to see who gets it first. They're twins, by the way. More about twins in a second. But you can tell from that the assessments everywhere. You'll be amazed at how often you get assessed in your life. So it is a fundamental thing that we understand in not only for schools, but also how we ourselves progress in life. And as it says there, the more assessment literate we become, the more able we can affect positive change for our students. We can become a wider part of the discussion. We can speak using the right terminology, understanding what's come before to know what we could do next. And so then Tim Oates, our research director here at Cambridge University Press and Assessment, wrote us the foreword for the book. And you'll see he's saying there that it's very much a shared public institution. Assessment is something which we all ought to know about. And so here indeed is an opportunity for people to learn a lot more about assessment and feel they're strong enough then to participate in discussions. Over to you, Simon.
Yeah, thank you very much, Paul. And again, I just want to echo my thanks to Amy Thornton and the various team that is behind the authors in terms of putting this together. It's been a really pleasurable experience working with Paul as well. And yeah, we hope that if you go ahead and buy the book and have a look, that you enjoy the contents inside. You're probably wondering why there's a picture of 2 little boys on the screen right now. What I wanted to talk to you about is a little bit about my own inspiration for the book and also a little bit about the content going forward. So as you can see on the right-hand side here are my twin boys, who at the time were about 9 weeks old, Peter on the left, Edward on the right. And you can see they're quite pleased with their dad, with the contents of the book. They look quite excited by the prospect of reading it when be a bit of bedtime reading for them, I think, in the next few years. And it was just this sense of that it's never you can never be too young or too old for professional learning. And you can see that they're quite excited, as am I. But what I wanted to do for this next few minutes is just talk about what the promises of the book are from someone who's maybe thinking about reading it and absorbing some of its contents. And in the introduction, we have what's called a confidence checker. Which is, it gives a sense of what we're looking for the readers of the book to achieve and learn by the end of it. So there's 12 statements here related to things like describing the purposes of assessment that teachers may have that are relevant to their practice, all the way through to describing key concepts in educational assessment, understanding ideas around well-being in terms of assessment, interpreting and using data effectively. And as you go through the book, there are chapters dedicated to each of these different elements. So what we ask the readers to do in the introduction is to rate themselves on a scale of 0 to 3 of how confident they are. Then afterwards, towards the end, and once you've read a few chapters, feel hopefully more confident. And I think confidence is a key word here when it comes to assessment in particular. When it is something that's highly technical, highly complex in many ways, lots of decisions that practitioners need to make on a day-to-day basis, sometimes in a minute-to-minute basis, having that confidence to innovate and to challenge is really what we're trying to get at for readers by the end of their time reading it. But what's actually in the book? The book itself is broadly broken up into 3 main parts A, B, and C. And in part A, the main focus of this is essentially getting to the kind of foundational principles of assessment. And a lot of the work that I do when I work for Cambridge Assessment and when I work with practitioners is working around this exact space and this learning area, and what we call kind of powerful knowledge, to use a Tim Oates term or a curriculum term. So we go through what is assessment, essentially the accumulation of evidence for a particular purpose. We then go into the very difficult technical area of validity and this idea that it's the one concept to rule them all. Everything, reliability, fairness, standards, all builds up to this idea of an overall argument for validity of your assessments. And again, this is a very academic area potentially, but what we've tried to do throughout the whole book is essentially distill it down into the fundamental parts, the key ideas that people will be able to take away and be able to repeat and understand and take forward. So we don't get bogged down too much with the academic side of things, but there is a little bit more information later about how we actually encourage people that are interested in that particular academic space to find out more as well with the reference list that's provided. So hopefully it caters for lots of different needs in that sense. We then look at reliability, so exploring the consistency of assessment. We look at the ideas of where unreliability can come from and how it can be resolved. Throughout these chapters, one thing that we look at very carefully is having what we call practical boxes, and I'll show you an example of that later on, in terms of how this overall idea of, say, reliability, how we can actually make practical decisions on something like mark scheme design to improve reliability going forward. So in that sense, even though we're talking about the broad principles, it still has a very practical application as well. And that's really what we're looking to get in part A. We look at fairness as well, which is an increasingly important topic, it seems. And we link in part A the overall ideas related to fairness to part C, where we look at very practical solutions in terms of accessibility, access arrangements, and other inclusivity and other key points as well. And also standards are things as they used to be. Now, the anecdote that we use for this particular book at the beginning of the standards chapter is a conversation that I think a lot of people have, but I had with my own dad, related to his degree classification when he went to university, which was a 2-2. I came out with a 2-1, and Dad said more or less exactly that. Things aren't what they used to be in terms of standards. So we actually explore those different ideas, what we actually mean by standards, and again, look at very practical applications for how standards are maintained and monitored over time as well. In part C, we look at those principles in much more actionable detail. And one thing that we're very keen to do in the book is to highlight and to lift the lid on what life is like in an assessment organization. So that's to look at things like how we recruit and create examination papers, how we recruit markers, how we go about the process of monitoring the standards of marking that are going through an organization. And that's something that opening up that black box, we felt was really important, just because it's something that that helps build trust between assessment organizations and the users and the stakeholders that are involved in assessment. We then look at drive into the kind of school-related elements, so things to do with standardization, moderation, and comparative judgment, which is becoming increasingly prevalent in terms of the thinking of schools up and down the country. This chapter on comparative judgment is, we think, particularly important because of that prevalence, but also we wanted people to know and to be informed in terms of if they're making the switch to using comparative judgment in their schools. What are the key arguments as to why it's seen as better, and also challenging some of those assumptions perhaps as well. And that's something to look out for in the book as well, from a technical perspective. Using assessment data, which is related to that, so if we think of data as input, how do we make sure that it's of the highest quality it can be? How do we analyze assessment data to make sure that our assessments are as valid as they can be? And what inferences can we make about students on that basis? What are the limitations of data? That's really fundamentally what we're looking to get to at that chapter. And then we look at 3 different areas that may be related to 21st century skills, if you were to put them into one broad category. So assessing community action and service, assessing collaboration, which is something that I've researched myself over the last 5 years or so, and assessing the expressive arts. And what's useful about these particular chapters is that we look very practically at what we would call the decision points of assessing those particular areas. How do you define the construct that you're interested in? How do you boil it down into a set number of tasks that you can be confident are accessing that particular construct, say collaboration? And then further from that, what decisions can you make in terms of the scoring and the marking to make sure that it's as fair as possible for the students? And I'll just hand over to Paul for the final part, part C.
Thanks, Simon. So yes, part C then, we struggled a bit with the title for this section, but we came up in the end with creating the conditions for learner success and assessment, because it covers a broad range of areas. First of all, about how to help students to get ready for when they're going to be taking some form of examination or other kind of assessment as well. So in that section there, we talk about things such as how competent you feel, whether you feel unconsciously competent, for example, or indeed unconsciously incompetent when you're preparing for something or other. We look at mindset, we look at things such as teachers as activators of learning as well. How can teachers encourage students to be the best prepared possible? So that includes areas such as assessment for learning, assessment as learning, metacognition, self-regulation, and also revision and exam techniques. So things that a lot of teachers may be familiar with already, but there's no harm in a refresher, and you may find some new ideas hopefully within that chapter too. Chapter 13, this was one which I think a lot of people were interested in when we first proposed the idea of the book. Mental health and well-being talked about a lot, but what do they really mean? So we dig into definitions there of what they mean with regards to assessment. We spend quite a lot of time focusing on test anxiety as an example there. So test anxiety has been researched quite a bit by various colleagues in other universities around the country. And here we talk about the signs, the causes, and also how to manage it, such as through preparation, even things like fitness, nutrition, and then more general support as well. Chapter 14 is to do with, well, special educational needs, neurodiversity, and other aspects where some students may find it more difficult than others to do what might be considered the ways that we exam or assess students these days. And so what we try to dig into there is, are there other ways in which we could assess students? What other possibilities are there? What can we learn from other walks of life or other means of education as well? So for example, in that, we were looking at what they're doing in higher education, because they, at least some higher education institutions, are at the forefront of this. Plymouth University, for example, Paul, you'll be pleased to know that, being a Plymouth football supporter, they're very much into looking at what they can do to try to help students along. They talk a lot about universal design for learning, for example, and they have their own 7 steps to inclusive assessment. So we're looking there at what might be possible, what other flexible modes of assessment there might be, and how that might also translate perhaps into the future for others. And it's very importantly assessment for all, rather than assessment just for some who might be a bit different. It's more about saying, is assessment in some ways fit for purpose? Is it inclusive enough so that everybody can access a means by which they can show how much they know and can do? So that leads us on to that final chapter, their assessment in the future, potentially the most controversial in the book, but not intended to be, because we've been, I think, quite fair and open in this chapter, discussing what people have been saying for some time now, but particularly recently, perhaps, in how assessment might look as we move forwards, having had assessment done in different ways over the last couple of years. So we don't reference COVID, the pandemic, directly and deliberately so, partly because we don't want to state the book, but also because there's more to it than that. There are many more considerations. So if you read that chapter, you'll see that we conclude that there could be 3 A's to consider for the future. What is appropriate, what is authentic, and again, what is accessible. We also look a little bit at digital technologies there, and we look at other ways in which, well, validity, reliability, standards, and everything can be recognized by the stakeholders. We particularly conclude there, you'll find out that it's all very well changing assessment, but you can't just convince yourself, you have to convince lots of other people too, otherwise they're not going to really pay much respect to the forms of assessment that you do. Back to you, Simon.
Yes, and I mentioned before about the key features for the book itself. I mean, one thing that we tried to do is just to not have reams of text, page after page of text, because that could be quite a laborious process. So what we've tried to do is break up the chapters into lots of different parts. So we've created reflection activities that can be used both on an individual basis, but I also think in the teaching context, it can be the kind of thing that you may want to have in some kind of continued professional development session, inset day, that sort of thing. Discussion tasks that are based on the previous material. And that's again very much for people to reflect on those different principles in their particular working context, with the idea of coming up with some kind of new way forward or new processes or new innovations that they may want to apply in the future. We also have the feature of what we call practical or hands-on methods. So these are very much driven in terms of encouraging the readers to be able to take something away with them automatically from reading the chapter. Gives them how-to guides, principles of mark scheme design, elements related to the design of, say, a collaborative task. So all of these different boxes that are within the book itself are designed to have that sort of take-home message, very much driven in the practical. And then finally, we have the extension boxes that are dotted around the book as well. And these are related to some of the key debates and ideas that, again, maybe more technical in focus. And they're maybe for people that want to take their debate further, or take the debate further, perhaps looking at things that are more complex or statistical. So an example for that would be looking at how reliable is comparative judgment really? And we look at some of the most recent research on that from Cambridge University Press and Assessment. Some of the scholars there have been looking at this issue in depth, and we try and again distill it into a package that gives you a key set of take-home messages. Again, just challenging maybe some of the assumptions about things like comparative judgment and other things as well. And the final point is just to where you can get your copy. So you may be able to see behind me that hopefully it's not too sort of faded out because of the lighting, but there is a 20% discount code available if you go through the Sage website, which is posted here. So if you just put in Sage and the title of the book, it should pop up automatically. It is available on Amazon, although other online stockists do exist. I've seen in the last couple of days that WH Smiths are also stocking it as well. So that's available. And if for those of you that are based in Cambridge, we have managed to get it stocked in heifers, I believe. So if you are able to go into the bookstore and support the local business, and then it's there for you to pick up as well if you so choose. Paul, over to you.
Yeah, and just to come there, thanks, Simon. Even though we may agree that Amazon is not always the best place to buy things, thanks, Andrew, for your comment on that in the chat there. In Amazon, if you look at the lists there, we're actually riding high already in the top 5, it would appear, of books of this nature. And we've got Dylan William above us, and that's probably only to be expected. But let's see if we can rise to the top. We'd love to with your help. But anyway, thank you very much in advance. If you do buy a copy of the book, we're really grateful, and we hope that importantly it is something which you're going to gain a lot from, and that you can then do something within your schools or wherever you work, whatever workplace you are in the future. So back over to the other Paul now. It's time for you, the audience, to ask us questions, or maybe Paul wants to start off with some questions too.
Thank you so much, both. And in fact, Simon, Paul, you've answered Andrew's question about where to get a copy, and that's great. You've really covered the ground, really well over the last few minutes, and in a very upbeat, positive way. I think you've given us all a very good feel for what the book is about, and how you've approached the structure of it, and so on. And it seems to me, having read the book, it's a very well balanced. You cover the ground; it's wide ground that you're covering, and you go into depth, but also you draw back, you give us that broader view, and so on. And to go back to your first slide, Paul, for me, I wish I'd read this book when I started my career. So, but it's a joy to read it now after all these years. And I think one of the things that surprised me, actually, given it's about assessment, and maybe it's a kind of like even a prejudice I kind of carry still, is like, oh, this is going to be quite heavy going. But in fact, you managed to have such a good flow throughout the book. So it's easy to move from one chapter to another to really develop this kind of broader view. And I felt reading it, you as authors, that you enjoyed the very process of writing this, of bringing what you know to bear, of going out and researching further and so on. So my question to you, and then there'll be other questions, I'm sure, from our colleagues, but my question is, in the process of preparing and then writing the book and so on, what did you find stimulating? Did you learn new things yourselves? What are the kind of highlights that you had? So each of you, both, please.
You want to go first, Paul, or shall I?
Yeah, you go ahead, Simon.
Yeah, I think for me, the idea of how we connect the different elements together was actually one of the most revealing elements of just the craft of putting a book together. I found was quite an interesting process. I mean, as I mentioned before, in the work that we do, the temptation is to keep the key principles of assessment just hanging as individual things, like somehow not acknowledging the interconnected nature of validity with reliability, with fairness, and then also the connections to part B and C in terms of how that actually is enacted in real life when the pressures of time and all those sorts of things, the manageability and all those other elements come into the discussion. So that process of one of the reasons why we made so many connections between the chapters and were quite conscious in doing that in terms of signposting was trying to acknowledge that interconnectedness. So in some ways we have lots of brackets, see chapter 3 for finding out more about reliability or whatever it may be. We do that quite a lot just to help people navigate that complexity. And that was something that was from a kind of almost a pedagogical perspective, how someone will work through a book. I found that a really interesting process. In terms of which chapters I found interesting to work on with Paul, as I mentioned before, the comparative judgment chapter, the idea of trying to bring the sense of something that is going to become more and more widespread in terms of its use in schools and so on. Teachers want to know what it actually means for them, particularly in comparison to more traditional methods of assessment, particularly if it becomes something that is linked to summative assessment in much more detail. So trying to, again, make that an accessible, relatable, and again, practical chapter that people can digest quickly and understand the key ideas and the key issues and debates around that. I found that was a really interesting chapter to write. So yes, that's 2 points from me.
And I'd echo a lot of what Simon had to say there. First of all, it was an absolute pleasure to write it with him. I learned an awful amount about assessment from Simon. Sorry, my lights have just gone off in here. Kind of go in the dark. So I learned a lot as I was writing the book with Simon. And the important thing for both of us was to try to make it in a digestible form that others can then take up and find useful for themselves as well. Often, if I may say so, there's a lot of theory about assessment that gets talked about in, you could say, quite difficult terminology. It's almost like you need to know a lot already before you can read certain papers or books. So what we deliberately tried to do here was to say, you don't need to read the other books or papers necessarily, albeit that we hope very much that people do go ahead and essentially click through and read those. Because in this book, it tells you a good amount. It tells you potentially enough for what you need for your purposes, perhaps working in a school, wherever you are in the world. So for me, it's great trying to think about, so how do we write this in such a way that it's very understandable for people, so that people like me, teacher in the past, who might be busy, can pick it up and think, oh yes, I do understand what that means now. And so we've done so by having relatively short chapters in the book as well. What else did I enjoy? Well, I enjoyed researching around all over the place. I think my wife may not agree because I spent an awful lot of time doing research on this book as well. So thanks very much to Dawn for allowing me to do that. But in the book, there are various bits where I really felt I wanted to dig a lot more deeply. So it enabled me to look at so many sources from all over the world, from Australia, from the United States, from the Republic of Ireland, etc., and also the aforementioned Plymouth University with what it was doing on inclusive assessment, for example. I wouldn't have known that had it not been for another person who'd put me in contact with people over there. So to speak to individuals, just as I did in the expressive arts chapter, for example, I spoke to somebody very high up in the Associate Board of Royal Schools of Music, and it was fascinating as a musician to listen to somebody who's high up in that organisation explain to me how music exams should be assessed and how they could be in the future. So for me, it's just a whole world of being immersed in assessment and really thoroughly now understanding what it means. And again, echoing you as well, Paul, as you were echoing me earlier, I wish I'd known this before, and I hope many readers may feel the same.
Thank you so much. Excellent. And just a question that's come in from Anik about, can the code be shared with schools, or is it something exclusive for Cambridge colleagues? There is this kind of, not tension, but this idea, obviously you're both working for Cambridge, but this is not a kind of Cambridge book. It's of general applicability. It's for the general audience, as it were. So the code that you shared, is that for general purpose, or is it only for Cambridge colleagues?
I believe it's available to anyone that's that wants to use it, as I understand it. Yeah, so it was linked to the launch events, but I think if it sort of comes, snowball effect from there, that's probably fine as far as I'm aware.
Okay.
Yeah. And there was just a question as well about putting the link to the Sage page in the chat as well. I should be able to do that if you just hang on for a second. Once the slide share is finished, I'll be able to root it out and find it for you and be able to add it to the chat. If not, I'll be able to send it around as an email afterwards.
And essentially, if anybody wants to just search for the book, then they will find it. Just put in Sage and then the title of the book, you'll find it straight away.
So a couple of questions are, in a sense, kind of reflexive, thinking about coming back into Cambridge in the sense of, will there be possibly an education brief that covers this? How you might think, I guess, how this is now going to be disseminated through the Cambridge channels, perhaps through an education brief. Also, are we planning to add it somewhere on our web pages, on our platforms, valuable reading resources and so on? So that's the kind of Cambridge question.
Yeah, thanks for that one. I mean, we as an organisation more broadly do talk a lot about assessment. So Simon can speak for what the Cambridge Assessment Network does, for example, in our own area. Just to say in brief, yes, we do. For those of you who don't know us so well, who might be tuning in, have a section on our website where we have what we call education briefs, and then other kinds of resources as well that explain in, well, brief detail certain key aspects of education. We don't have the intention of doing anything on this because, again, as Paul's just explained, this is not a Cambridge book, and perhaps we should have emphasised that a bit earlier as well. This was written deliberately so that it's curriculum agnostic. We don't want people to think it's just about Cambridge exams or OCR exams that are part of our organisation as well. It's about the IB, it's about College Board, it's about any kind of exam board, or indeed any kind of examining or awarding organisation that does some form of assessment. So it's relevant to everything everywhere. So it's not really a Cambridge thing much that we both work for this organisation. It's for everybody. So we wouldn't necessarily do anything on this unless indeed colleagues think eventually we should build something around this as well.
Super. Very interesting question from Craig here about the chapter on assessing expressive arts. Does this chapter explore the assessment of creativity as a perhaps less observable trait? Artistic intention, similarly, conscious that evidencing this in a defensible and consistent way, particularly when internally assessed, can be challenging. So I'm keen to read your writing on this area, says Craig. So Paul, you're smiling here. So.
Well, thanks, Craig, for the question. I'm only going to answer in brief detail because the book does indeed go into more detail on this, and Simon might want to pick up some things extra to what I say as well. The chapter there talks first about what are the expressive arts, and so it tries to define them in certain ways. It then goes into looking at, so how are expressive arts assessed in various forms. So we look at the Queensland Authority in Australia, for example, and what it does with dance. We look at other examples and what they do with drama. We look at one to do with film studies. We look at another one to do with music. And I mentioned a few moments ago the Associated Board of the Royal Schools of Music as well. So it's not just an exam board that offers lots of qualifications. It's ones which actually focus on particular expressive arts as well. So we dig into that, and then we discuss a bit. So how easy, how difficult is it? Is it something which indeed is less observable? Is it something where people almost have a gut feeling for whether it's good or not? And so we provide various lists there and looking at how critics in art, for example, might judge a work of art, or indeed how people who are examiners in visual arts may look at something and pretty much know what they feel about it, but then they have to go back and look at the assessment criteria and think, okay, so that does work with that does work with that, and therefore that justifies the kind of mark that I want to give to it too. We talk also about portfolios. Portfolios, of course, then in turn connects in other ways to other types of assessment, be it say for vocational studies, for professional development qualifications, as we do here at Cambridge University Press and Assessment as well, and other forms too. So I'm hoping, Craig, that some of your question may be answered by reading the chapter. We don't, I must admit, make any necessary conclusions which necessarily answer your question there, but we do certainly delve into the detail of it and look at essentially the map of the problematic around assessing expressive arts. I don't know if Simon, you've got anything to add to that?
Yeah, just to point to some of the other chapters as well. I mean, again, just link it to this interconnectedness. So what it is to be assessed is some kind of theatre production, for example, some of the things that come from the collaboration chapter will be relevant, and some of the practical tips that are in that chapter will be relevant to that particular task as well, if indeed that's how the expressive arts has been set up. So I think it's important to not just consider it as a kind of siloed construct. There are other elements that come into that, and I think that actually adds to the complexity in some ways. But yeah, there'll be things in that chapter as well that may be of interest to you as well.
Super. I think you certainly set out sufficient, in a sense, a framework to think through the issues. You pose interesting questions in the chapter there, Paul. It's kind of the style of the book. You kind of give people resources to think with. You set out structures and so on. So it's not, this is how it is. Yeah, it's not that kind of approach I feel that you take, which is really, really helpful. And Proserpina is asking, do you feel that in the future we might have educational institutions that are collaborating with tertiary institutions to accept students without summative assessments, as we've seen recently? So this is a future, question about the future. And another aspect of your book is you're looking to the future with what you're saying. So do you have any ideas about that?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, and one we could probably explore over many hours. I think we've only got a few minutes left, but in terms of my initial thought about that, it's really an element of, do those institutions, those stakeholders, those users of the assessment, whether that's the tertiary institution or the one previously, do they trust the version of the assessment that they're being asked to be trusted, or the one that they're being expected to trust? So if they don't trust that particular assessment for whatever reason, whether it's a validity issue or a consistency or some other element, the temptation for ones that aren't highly regulated is that almost it creates a new market for assessments that they do trust. So I think if the standards and other elements, so to go to the A-level example, if there was a fall down in trust of that particular standard, then universities may be looking at other options in terms of accepting students through other means, through other types of assessment. But I don't think that the universities, for example, would ever accept students without some form of assessment, mainly because they need to have that trust in the student. So do you feel in the future we might have educational institutions to accept students without summative assessments? I think that's unlikely. But what may change is that the kind of free market idea of different universities coming up with their own approved assessments that allow them into their institutions, that may change over time as certain assessments gain status and credibility in some way. So that's my first pass view on that.
And all I would add to that is I would really like for higher education institutions to collaborate more strongly with what happens in the secondary sector, so they have a greater understanding. We can see quite big gaps, particularly in certain subject areas, between one and the other. And it's a shame there are missed opportunities here for people to understand a lot more at each level what's happening in the other level. So I wish there would be a bit closer collaboration between the two levels.
Thank you
Thanks,
both
Paul,
very much. Thank you so much. And we've got to sort of 1:45, which I think was the time we felt was a good closing time. But but thank you so much for the way you've answered these questions, the questions themselves. And I'm sure we've all seen the kind of really positive feedback you're receiving, people who may have already been reading the book, who really now want to go and get the book and read it and so on. So I think that's super to see. I've got one more question for you both. Is how can people keep in touch? You know, are there ways in which people can keep in touch with yourselves? Is there sort of carry on conversations around and about the book? Would you like to hear from people?
Oh yes, definitely. I'm not sure if anyone caught on the title slide that I do have a Twitter account. So if anyone wants to tweet me about that, so that's @SimonChild11. So not the most glamorous of titles, but yeah, that's a perfect way to get in touch with me. I'm also on social media in the general sense, so LinkedIn and so on. So if you just put in Simon Child into LinkedIn, hopefully I'll be somewhere near the top. And yeah, I'll be happy to talk further.
And likewise for me, I don't have my own Twitter stuff going on. So social media for me is via LinkedIn. If anybody wants to connect with me, I think a lot of people on this call probably know where to find me anyway, and you're more than welcome to contact me further. And indeed, those on this call, if they want to then involve other people in the conversation, very happy to do so. It's what I'm about. I want to try to help and support schools and educators around the world as much as I can. So I'll be delighted to enter into conversations with anybody and have similar chats as this session has been with others as well.
Thank you, Simon, Paul. Thank you for your openness, your enthusiasm, your encouragement, and everything you've put into this book, and what you continue to do concerning assessment. Thank you to everybody who's attended today. Obviously, I wish you all really the very best in your professional practice. I'm very sure the book's going to help your thinking and your practice, and also going to be terribly valuable for your discussions with your colleagues and indeed with your learners too. So all the very best. Take care. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul.